every week in his class, he would bring in a different Jim Crow related artifact for us to have discussions about race in America. We will always start a class off with these different artifacts. So this one particular class, he brings in this, what they call a nigger head bank. But, and he just asked a simple question. And he asked us, what do you see? Perception is very interesting, man, because you got this bank and everybody in the class, this diverse class of people, see different things. Some people saw a black man. Some people saw a monkey. Some people saw a toy. Some people saw, I don't think anybody saw a bank at first until he turned it around and said, no, this is a bank.
You are now on a social experiment.
See now where my limit is. Only got no.
Welcome to the program. Thank you for joining us today on the journey towards self-mastery. Our next guest is the founder of the Black History 101 Mobile Museum. He's an educator, an author, a former hip-hop manager. The Black History Mobile Museum has been an award-winning collection of over 10,000 original artifacts of Black memorabilia dating from the transatlantic slave trade to hip-hop culture. He's been called the Schomburg of the hip-hop generation. The Black History Mobile Museum has been in more than 41 states and over 1,000 institutions, sharing our story with K-12 students, college students, conferences, libraries, museums, festivals, religious institutions, and cultural events. The Black History Mobile Museum was featured in a Toyota commercial this year, honoring people in the Black community that are striving to make a difference in their communities. Let's welcome today Dr. Khalid El-Hakim to the program. Dr. El-Hakim, how you doing today,
Mr.
sir?
G, I'm doing great, man. I'm honored to be here with you today, and I look forward to this conversation.
Likewise, man. The pleasure is mine, man. And I'm glad we're having this conversation now because, we talked before and we're actually supposed to get this going for Black History Month. But, you got a little busy and everything, which is all good. There's this whole idea, and I'm glad about the work that you're doing too, but there's this whole idea of us having to cram everything in and crunch everything in for Black History Month and get the history, get the culture, get everything about Black folks in this short month of February, man. So I'm really excited about the work that you're doing, kind of extending that. And I'm glad that we're having this conversation, outside of the month of February.
Yes, indeed. Yeah, it's been a busy first 3 months. I got on the road January 6th, and it's been 38 stops in, I think, about 13, 14 states. And then I had two other exhibits with two other teams of mine, and they went to about 10 stops in about 5 other states. So it's been busy, and just getting off the road last week. But it's been great, man. The response has been overwhelming. You get a sense that this is needed, it's valued, and really you just can't get enough of this on the road and sharing it with communities all across the country. So it's a phenomenal work.
Yes, sir, man. I think it's much needed, man. I'm glad it's us that's in this space doing it because it could have been somebody else. You know what I'm saying?
And there are other people doing the work too, man. But we have to put that clean glass of water next to the dirty glass and let people make that choice.
Well said. Well said. So we just talked about Black History Month, man. I know every February you get involved in new things with the museum and this and that, new curations and new things that you're doing. So this month, what was it like? With the museum this month, man? What were some special things that was going on?
This year is the 50th anniversary of hip hop. Yeah, the exhibit that we do this year is the theme. We call it Hip Hop at 50. So it's 150 or so artifacts celebrating hip hop from its very beginnings in the Bronx with some of the pioneers, people like Africa Bambaataa, Kool Herc, DJ Flash, as well as, the Funky 4+1 More, MC Shy Rock. As a matter of fact, MC Shy Rock travels with the museum, 3 dates with me up in Wisconsin. Of course, Professor Griffin, Public Enemy, travels with the museum as well. And he does solo exhibits as well as exhibits with me as well. So I believe he did about 7 or 8 dates. Our last stop, I had Sister Khalila Ali, Muhammad Ali's former wife, with the museum as a guest speaker. And she did a couple of dates in Florida with me as well. And man, it's been busy, man. 2.5 months. But the year is just getting started as well, so we got a lot more to do.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. And I definitely want to backtrack a little bit, but before we do that, I also noticed, I'm flipping through, social media, and I see your picture all the time during February for Black History Month with the Toyota
Yeah.
commercial. And I don't know, maybe the algorithm had me, but every time I'm flipping through, I saw Dr. El-Hakim with Toyota thing. So how'd that come about, man?
It was really an honor, man. I've been managing groups now for about 25 years, and early on, I had a group that I was managing called Third Eye Open, and one of the poets in the group also worked in the advertising industry as well. And he approached me early last year and he said that he had an opportunity for the museum, and I didn't know what it was. And he brother hit me up and said, this is what it is, and told me to show up in California for this date. And it went really smooth, man. It was Need a Nudge campaign for Toyota. And pretty much what they were doing was providing opportunities of support, financial support for nonprofit organizations that were making a difference in communities across the country. So when the commercial came out and when the social media material came out, I started getting emails and phone calls and text messages from all over the country. I honestly did not know how far-reaching this campaign was going to be. They told me to be prepared for it, but it's really not something you really can prepare for. And so you got people just reaching out. And it was a phenomenal visibility campaign for the museum, but from the feedback that I got from some of the other organizations, just overall, just nationwide, it really had an impact on a lot of people's lives. And I was honored to be the spokesperson for that campaign, one of the three spokespersons for the campaign. So it was powerful.
Yes, it was, man. Yes, it was. You don't see that too often, too. So I'm glad they were able to have that representation and everything during the month of February. I wanted to backtrack a little bit, man. People might be wondering, well, what is this Mobile Museum? How did it all start? All this, what your story is and everything. So let's take it back, man. Let's take it back into Detroit public schools and you growing up, in Detroit and all that, man. So what was that time period like for you growing up and kind of maneuvering through the public school system? And I've actually heard you talk positively about the Detroit public schools.
Yeah, in our talks, I'm sure I told you, man. I always, growing up, thought of, reflecting back now, I saw myself growing up in Wakanda. And I say that simply because growing up, I always saw black people in positions of power. So I always, I grew up in the 70s, 80s, and left Detroit in the late 80s for college. But that 70s and 80s period, I always had a black mayor, black city council people, black clergy, black entrepreneurs in the city, black superintendents, black police officers, black chief of police, commissioners.
Right.
Everybody in political and economic power, as far as I could see, as a youngster growing up, were mainly black people. So that had a huge impact on me going to school in the Detroit public schools. My teachers were teachers who, the black teachers that I had were teachers who were just coming out of the civil rights, black power movement. So, I mean, to see folks who were conscious and saw the value and importance of teaching black history or just being present for black students had an impact on me as well. So early on, I remember I had a teacher, a math teacher in elementary school, fourth grade, fifth grade, Dr. Shelton. And Dr. Shelton had an afro, salt and pepper afro, but was always that father figure, hard disciplinarian, but was going to teach us math by any means necessary, right? He came to class every day, suit and tie, just a great representation of a black man as a teacher. And that stuck with me. And I remember when I went to college, came back with my teaching certificate, he was the first person I went to go see when I became a teacher, and just to let him know that he had a huge impact on me. But also, I remember a teacher I had in high school, Dr. Shoshana Shakur, who was the sister of Chokwe Lumumba, the civil rights attorney, who was actually amongst many other great clients that he had. Tupac was one of his clients as well. But he was a revolutionary freedom fighter lawyer who came out of the Republic of New Africa back in the 60s and early 70s. And I remember her talking about him a whole lot in class. And, and it was her class I learned the principles of Kwanzaa at a time where no one was talking about Kwanzaa. But I had the sister who was really deep into the culture. And so experiences like that, man, just left an imprint on me. On a young, this young man coming up in DPS, it had an impact. And, and I can say this, it definitely planted a seed. And, seeds sometimes takes a long time for them to grow. But, when it hits hard, man. So, Sister Shoshana, I still keep in contact with her. But, I had some great, I had great counselors, and just that experience was very affirming, helped me grow into a great student. Although I have to say I was only a C student in school, out of all that, I was just, your average student, you know what I'm saying? But I got through the process. One thing a lot of people don't know about me, though, is that because of the impact of Black police officers in my life, I ended up going to college to become a police officer. I was initially in the criminal justice program at Ferris State University. But growing up in my teenage years, I was a part of the Detroit Police Explorers. I took leadership roles in that. So the idea of making contributions back to my community was very much instilled in me as a teenager working with the Detroit Police Explorers. And then, eventually when I decided to go to college, it was on a law enforcement track. Yeah, but we'll get into that in a little bit.
Oh, let's get into it right now. I'm curious, what made you transition away from that?
It was a traumatic experience while I was a student on this campus, this PWI campus, predominantly white institution, Big Rapids, Michigan. I was coming out of a restaurant. It was culture shock too, coming from the city, Detroit, which was predominantly at that time probably 85, 90% Black, going to a town that probably had a 4%, 5% Black population, if that. So, if you're Black in this town, you're standing out. But anyway, I was coming out of a restaurant, and as I was walking out, some police were pulling up. They got out of their cars and they had their guns drawn and told me to get up against the wall. I had no idea what was going on. Never had a gun pulled on me before in my life. So that first experience with white police officers in that type of situation was traumatic. And I was trying to figure out what was going on, but they were telling me that an armed robbery had just took place in this restaurant. And as I'm looking around, I'm seeing white folk walking in and out of this restaurant while I'm up against the wall. And I'm like, y'all letting, if it's an armed robbery going on, you letting people walk in and out, like, how'd y'all choose me? And it was a bunch of, shut up stuff and that type of thing, man. Just real disrespectful. And then one of the cops goes into the restaurant, and then he comes back straight faced and says, "Oh, let him go." The bartender hit the alarm. All that trauma that I experienced, all those assumptions that they made about my race, I had to deal with. So it was no apologies, nothing like that. And so that experience right there, man, just pretty much got me into the mindset of, if that's what law enforcement is about, I don't want to be a part of that, and want to go through this law enforcement process, definitely at Ferris State. I just didn't want to do it based upon that experience. So I pivoted and looked into education. And because of the positive experiences I had with educators, Black educators, I still knew that I wanted to make a contribution to my community somehow. So education was my experience, and that my commitment.
That kind of led you right into Dr. at Fisk University, Dr. Pilgrim, which we had on the program. Yeah, Ferris State University, Dr. Pilgrim, which we had on the program for his Jim Crow Museum. Yes. Great interview. So I think he was in the beginning of his teaching tenure, right? At Ferris State.
I want to say I might have been, if not his first class, definitely the first year that he was there. So, but yeah, Dr. Pilgrim, very committed to sociology, very committed to as a collector of artifacts, Jim Crow related artifacts, Black history artifacts as well. But I took his class, I think it was the fall of 1990, and went into his class, and every week in his class, he would bring in a different Jim Crow related artifact for us to have discussions about race in America. We will always start our class off with these different artifacts. So this one particular class, he brings in this what they call a niggerhead bank, and it's a cast iron bank with these exaggerated features, big red lips.
Reminds me of Invisible
From,
Man.
like that bank from Bamboozle.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yep,
yeah.
yep,
So,
yep. Yep.
but and he just asked a simple question, and he asked us, "What do you see?" Perception is very interesting, man, because you got this bank, and everybody in the class, this diverse class of people, see different
Mhm.
things. Some people saw a black man, some people saw a monkey, some people saw a
Mm.
toy, some people saw. I don't think anybody saw a bank at first until he turned it around and said, "No, this is a bank." But the power of an artifact to get people to talk, get people to talk about uncomfortable situations such as race
Mhm.
in this particular case, and knowing the history that an object like this carries, and the memories that it brings out for people who've experienced that, and some of those
Mhm.
students who grew up in households where they saw those types of things. So it carries memory as well. So having those types of conversations were very, very powerful. And so for me, having that experience piqued something in me, and made me want to go out and start collecting that type of material. So it was shortly after this class that I started going out and collecting that material.
Mm. And by going out and collecting the material, like, were you knocking on people's
Mhm.
doors, like, "Yo, you got any?" Like, what
Yeah, so
what
me
was your
going out,
process
my
like?
my process, and let me back up too and say this. I've always been a collector. I've always been a collector.
Mhm.
I started off collecting comic books, baseball cards,
Mm.
football cards, basketball cards. And that's what me and my close friends on my block in Detroit used to do. That's how we passed time. That's how we engaged each other. All
Right.
right. Trading cards and comic books and that type of thing. Going to baseball games and football games, meeting athletes and getting them to sign material we had, that type of stuff. So I always had that type of orientation to and to collect those types of that type of material. So when it came to
Mhm.
collecting Jim Crow, initially Jim Crow material, because of being in Dave Pilgrim's class, Dr. Pilgrim's class,
Right.
I started going into antique shops, mainly up in where I was in the Big Rapids area. So going into
Mhm.
antique shops, going into flea markets, going into some garage sales, and just digging through material, man, and finding old sheet music, finding some of those figurines, old newspapers and magazines and children's books as well. So that was my process starting off. Going.
Mhm. Now, at that point, how did you know, like, this is worthy of keeping versus this is like trash, this is
Well,
old, like, nobody wants
yeah,
this?
anything that had stereotypical images that depicted us in a negative way, I was picking all that stuff up. And yeah, I really wanted starting off, really wanted the original material, so I kind of focused on that. But you go into places and you see salt and pepper shakers that were made, in the early '90s. So and you realize that things are still being mass produced at that time, and even today the stuff
Mhm.
is being mass produced. So I was picking up
Mhm.
just a little bit of everything. So anything that could help shed a light on the reality of the history of race in America, and how black image had been used in many different types of ways in the society to put forth an idea of us being inferior, of us being less than, of us being ugly, as a way to make white folks feel good about themselves, and a way to, make sure that we would never compete with them, right?
Right, right.
For housing, for jobs, for education, for all those things, help people be mobile in the society, socially and politically and economically mobile in the society. So, but all these artifacts did that, and I was amazed all the different ways our image was used to promote these ideas.
Yeah. Now, in the beginning, I know, like, over time, you kind of like grow numb to, collecting some of these things. In the beginning, did you have any experiences that you were like, why would anybody collect this, or that would anger you?
Well, I mean, it
And
still angers me, but I think
mm,
the anger is more focused now. But I remember going down to Daytona Beach. This is just a couple months after taking David Pilgrim's class. And I respect my brother, Dr. Pilgrim. And we were walking along the beach in Daytona, and we stopped into a gift shop. And so, I'm expecting in a gift shop to see, postcards and, things about Florida, right? But there's a T-shirt on display in this antique, or it's not an antique shop, it's a gift shop, souvenir shop. This T-shirt has an image of Dr. King with a target over his head and the words that read, "Our dream came true." This is 1991. And so I don't think I've ever been as angry as I was seeing that and disgusted. You know what I'm saying? So as a 20-year-old, like how do you deal with that? I mean, for me, I want to go and tear stuff up, right? You realize, if you do that, there's consequences to that as well, right? So
right.
But I found a copy of the T-shirt online a few years ago by using it in my presentation. But it's a teachable moment as well, because you look at 1991 and see what was going on. You had the Rodney King situation happening. So this T-shirt is the backlash to Rodney King, right? But it's also that target being over his head as well. It's also backlash to Public Enemy. All right, so they took Public Enemy's logo, put it on King's head, because if you remember, 1991 was also looking at the Martin Luther King Day holiday. A lot of people grew up, and this holiday has always been a part of their lived experience. So people don't know that there was a process for the King holiday to become a holiday, and it dates all the way back to 1968 when he was assassinated, right? It was because it was Congressman John Conyers who wrote the initial bill, I think 3 or 4 days after he was assassinated, for the King holiday. And it took from 1968 all the way up into 1983 for the public to even be oriented or taught the value of even having someone like Dr. King be celebrated and having his own holiday. And so it was people like Coretta Scott King and Harry Belafonte and Gil Scott Heron and Stevie Wonder and Dick Gregory and many, many other people who had to teach the society and get the society ready to honor King in such a way. But of course, when it became a federal holiday, not every state in America accepted the holiday, right? So fast forward to 1991, Arizona being one of the last states in America to celebrate the King holiday, it came at a price for them, all right? And because of hip-hop groups like Public Enemy, and Public Enemy's response and the threat of a boycott of the state of Arizona, and they wrote the song and put the song out, "By the Time I Get to Arizona," and they called for a boycott of the state. So no conferences, no vacations, no X, Y, and Z. And at this time, Public Enemy had an international fan base. All right. So he put enough pressure on the state of Arizona for them to finally celebrate and honor the Dr. King holiday. So that one T-shirt has all these messages going along with it, on top of just for people walking in and seeing it, just the traumatic experience of just having to deal with that. But again, the power of one object to tell a story is phenomenal. And to answer one of your questions, I learned the power of an artifact to tell a story via Dr. Pilgrim's class.
Yeah, it's powerful, man. That is powerful. Just that one item having so many different, meanings, and just seeing the way that people think too, because I think sometimes we assume that people have our own thinking patterns and don't really think about how they think and how they function in their mind and things like that. So those things really bring about those conversations and just the awareness of how other people view things and operate, so it's really interesting.
Isn't it interesting that this T-shirt was in Florida in 1991, and here we are in 2023, and we see what's still going on in Florida, right?
Yes, sir.
So, things, we think things have changed, but, things have not changed a whole lot. They're still dealing with
Yeah, they remain.
Yeah.
They remain the same, man. So along with everything, I guess around that time, you went to the Million Man March, man. So Can you walk us through, like, first, like, what made you want to go to the Million Man March, and then what your experience was there and how you thought about it afterwards?
Absolutely. The Honorable Minister Farrakhan in 1994 came to Detroit, and he spoke at Cobo Hall in Detroit. And about 10,000 black men showed up that day to hear him speak. And he made this call for 1 million black men to go to Washington, D.C. Now, I was just finished Ferris State at that time, and just started my teaching career. Yeah, I had just started my teaching career. I always said that if I was around in 1963 when Dr. King made his "I Have a Dream" speech at the mall in DC, that I would have been there. I mean, this is just one of those moments, historical moments, that you want to say that you were present, right? So, because I didn't have that experience, when that call was made, something in me said, this is a historical experience that you might want to go and be a part of. And honestly, I didn't know that, I had no idea how many men were going to show up. But again, for history's sake and for the sake of trying to do something for myself and community, I heeded that call. And so I got on a bus on October 14th, 1995, with some brothers in Detroit. And I want to say Detroit probably had one of the biggest contingencies of black men that traveled, or at least the state of Michigan did, that went to Washington. But I want to say there was probably about 20 buses of us that went down. And man, it was an incredible experience. I mean, just the trip going to DC was an incredible experience. And because I remember being on the turnpike and just seeing cars and buses, hundreds of miles outside of DC. But, we stopped for gas or stopped to get food, and you see black men just on the road making that trip. And man, it was powerful. And I just, once I started to see that happening, I kind of was convinced that this was, if nothing else, if it wasn't 1 million men, then this was going to be something that was amazing. So, at one point, it didn't even matter. I just knew I was being a part of something that was going to be incredible. But the next day, we got to the mall. We parked the bus, got on the metro, I guess the metro train, and went to the mall. And I think it was about 5 o'clock in the morning, and you could hear the call to prayer and hear, drums. And man, by the time the sun came out and you looked around, bro, it was black men everywhere, as far as the eye could see, right? I think around 10 o'clock, they were saying there was more than 1 million men on the mall. And you could see, and we were shoulder to shoulder, bro. And from that time up until Minister Farrakhan spoke, there was barely any movement, man. I mean, if you could find the bathroom, you were lucky. You know what I'm saying? But it was shoulder to shoulder. But man, I tell people often, if we just focused on the black women who spoke to us that day, that would have been more than enough. You had Maya Angelou, all right, spoke to us. You had Dr. Dorothy Height. Dr. Dorothy Height, bro, was one of the co-organizers of the March on Washington. Did you know she didn't speak at the March on Washington? As a matter of fact, no black woman spoke at the March on Washington. Rosa Parks spoke to us that day, and Dr. Betty Shabazz spoke to us. Malcolm X's widow spoke to us that day, and it was powerful, bro. Those women poured into us and affirmed us and encouraged us, and and changed the lives of many of us, man. And that story, even to today, has not been properly told. I mean, brothers showed up, man, and so many positive things came out as a result of that. From everything from voter registration drives, voter registration going through the roof with black men, to black men going home and being better fathers, taking care of the families and the children, to many black men who started businesses. The idea of the Black History 101 Mobile Museum comes directly out of my experience there. The day before the Million Man March, this was just a private collection I had in my apartment. But coming back, because we made pledges, all of us made a pledge to go back and make a difference in our community. And so for me,
Right.
as a 25-year-old, I'm thinking to myself, what do I have to contribute? What can I contribute? And Minister Farrakhan told us to go back and join an organization. A lot of people were saying, well, this was like a membership drive for the Nation of Islam. It was far from that. You know what I'm saying? He told us he didn't care what political ideology, religious ideology, go back and get involved. Go back and get involved with something. And I went back to Detroit and I started to go to grassroots community meetings from different organizations. And one organization in particular was a brother by the name of Minister Malik Shabazz, who was a part of an organization called the New Marcus Garvey Movement and the New Black Panther Nation. And so I started going to his community meetings, and every week he would bring in, well, not every week, probably about every month he would bring in a different Black scholar. So, whether it was Dale Jones or Runoko Rashidi or Dr. Barashango or Dr. Khalid Muhammad, Professor Griff. I mean, just all types of people would come up through these meetings. And, for me at that time, I didn't have a great knowledge of self. So I was learning from these scholars, right? And, it had an impact on me, and it had me reading a lot more. And so I asked Minister Malik one meeting if I could share a couple of tables of artifacts. And he encouraged it and supported it. And when people saw the material I had, the first thing they thought was that I was a part of the Dr. Charles Wright Museum. And I was like, no, this is my own personal material. And they, people were impressed, man. And the ball started rolling with the Black History 101 Mobile Museum through that experience.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's fascinating, man. Yeah, I've heard a few stories about the Million Man March, man, and I feel like we need another one, definitely, man. For the next generation that didn't experience it, man, just to get that reminder about building and giving back to our communities and our responsibility as men, man. I think we definitely need another one, man.
Absolutely, indeed.
Yeah, man. So around the same time, you are doing your thing in the classroom as a social studies teacher, and you're doing it a little bit differently. You're doing the artifacts thing with the kids and things like that. And then you also realize that you had a neighbor that you didn't really know about, and you learned that this was Malcolm X's brother.
Yes. Yes.
And yeah, man, you bring them into the classroom, man. So can you walk us through that whole experience, and then also the difference, I think, in educating the kids when it comes to social studies from artifacts during, history, and not just, going and flipping through textbooks and all that. Like, what was that experience? And then what was that experience bringing Malcolm X's brother in there?
Yeah. So growing up, 5 houses down from me was Mr. and Mrs. Little. They were a quiet couple, older couple, kept a immaculate yard, just clean, clean house. Everything was, the yard was just beautiful, house beautiful. And, and the relationship was always, hi, Mr. Little, how you doing today? And it was just very much neighborly like that. But there was no, going over and sitting at the feet of this man, right? But it was just always cordial. And so, but I grew up in a neighborhood, and this is 70s and 80s, and people forget that Malcolm X was not popular in the Black community in the 1980s. We're in our school experience, we're being pushed King, right? And Malcolm was always seen like that's somebody you don't really talk about. And so, growing up in my neighborhood, I mean, we had it was mainly Black Christian folk in the neighborhood, very conservative for the most part. So the idea of a Muslim or a Malcolm X, people was shying away from that, right? So 1989 and 90, I believe, one of my boys called me, and he's like, man, Spike Lee is on the block. Like, Spike Lee's on the block. Like, what is he doing on the block? He's like, man, he's down there talking to Mr. Little. Like, why is he talking to Mr. Little? He's like, man, Mr. Little's, Malcolm X's brother, Wilford. And I'm just like, whoa, like, I had no idea. You know what I'm saying? I had no idea. Yeah, man. So fast forward, I'm teaching at the Detroit Job Corps at the point, I think this was 94, at the point that, no, was it 96? I was teaching at the Detroit Job Corps, and I went down and talked to Mr. Little and told him about the work I was doing in terms of museum work and collecting, because he didn't know about that up until that point. And then I told him I was teaching a lesson on Malcolm, and I was showing the movie Malcolm X to my students. And he said that he would come down and talk to my students, man. And he came down and I mean, just spent some time with my students and answered questions. It was very honest, very in depth. And he was really a quiet man and wouldn't tell you much if you didn't ask him. But if you asked him, he'd tell you. He obviously had a whole bunch to say. You know what I'm saying? So, but I had had a chance to build with him on a couple of occasions, and he actually made a couple of donations to the museum as well. A couple posters and a photograph of him, Malcolm, and his their other brother Filbert. Yeah. So, but yeah, man, he was a beautiful person. And then to answer your other question about engaging the students, I've always found that as teachers, it's important for us to meet our students where they are. Parallel to me being a teacher, as well as being a collector, I'm also working in the entertainment business as well. So, and one of my first clients as a booking agent is this group called The Last Poets. And I'm also working with a young sister who was just starting off on her career as a poet. Her name is Jessica Care Moore, and she's now, a huge poet, internationally known. But she was just starting off in Detroit back then, but went on Apollo back in '95, I believe. And she won Apollo doing spoken word 5 times in a row, 5 weeks in a row. And this was, the first time a spoken word artist ever did that. But because of my relationship with her, I was bringing her into my classroom as well. She was speaking to my students. So I was meeting my students culturally where they were in terms of, interest in hip hop, not necessarily having an interest in poetry at the time, but as a teacher, being able to make those connections between poetry and hip hop sparked their interest, right? And be able to make those connections, they were very open to that. And then, just like Dr. Pilgrim, man, I would bring in an artifact every week. I was teaching a geography course one year, and so every year, this is back when you actually had to find coordinates on a map, right? So I would bring in a artifact. So, for example, I might bring in a basketball from LA, right? From the LA Lakers, Magic Johnson, signed by Magic Johnson, and have them and give them have them find coordinates of LA on a US map, right? And so, but having that basketball, have them talk about the Lakers, Magic Johnson, and get them open to that, and then ask them, where do you think in America that ball came from, because it came from somewhere. And so and then have them find the coordinates. But once you have them do that, you open the interest up, and then show them that, oh, this makes sense, this has a value. You build a skill set for them. And so that's just just one example of many, where you can engage students and have them do interesting things that open them up.
Yeah, man, I think it's just so much different than just flipping through textbooks and watching like old school documentaries. And once you see the artifact, it's like you're immersed in it. It's different,
exactly,
man.
I mean, and you almost take ownership of that experience as well. You know what I'm saying? Because it makes history real for the students. And then, of course, as teachers, as you well know, you walk into a classroom and you're given these textbooks, and you assess these textbooks for the value it has historically. And as a Black teacher with Black students, you want to know where the Black history is in it. And if it's not present, then we have an issue. We have a challenge, right? So how do you supplement what's missing in this textbooks to engage your students? Because if the students don't see themselves represented in the book, or if they're represented in these textbooks in very narrow ways, that sends a message to the students. So, and we want to send positive messages to our students that they are valuable, that their history counts, that they have made contributions to not only this society, but the world society,
Yes,
historically.
sir.
So that, that's what we're tasked with as educators, right? So, and again, my methodology for that was using primary source material.
Right. Yeah, man. I think that's amazing, man. So at the same time, you're doing your thing in the classroom, you're doing your thing out of the
Yeah.
classroom, getting the artifacts together. At what point did it bobble your mind that, I could turn this into a mobile museum and travel around the country
Yeah.
and do my thing? Like, you know what I'm saying? So when did it pop into your mind? And then when were you like, willing to take that risk and be like, I'm going to take a break from teaching and make this happen?
Man, so it was 2010, 13 years into teaching at this point. And the visibility of the museum was getting popular around Detroit or was coming up in Detroit. I did 10 years of putting this on the road around the city, a little bit more than 10 years. And because of the visibility of the museum, I got to the point where I started thinking, I'm about to turn 40. I might be able to do this full time. So my reasoning was, all right, at 40, if I put 10 years into this museum, by the time I'm 50, then if all else fails, then I can go back into the classroom. I love teaching, so that's no big deal. I'll go back and, and I also decided that I was going to go get a master's degree as well. So 10 years, master's degree, I'll go back into the classroom if all else fails, right? But once I made that decision and to leave and took that leap of faith, man, it just, the world opened up. The world opened up, man. And I told my wife, I'm willing to go anywhere I'm invited. And, when I put that out into the atmosphere, I was saying it just to be saying it. But once the phone call started and the email started coming in, I had no idea it was going to be so far reaching into all the different types of places that I would end up going. So very, very rural areas to, very metropolitan, urban New York City, Manhattan areas. You know what I'm saying? It's run the whole gamut. But it's been a phenomenal experience. But yeah, it was 2010 that I decided to make that decision to do it full time.
Mm-hmm. And why a mobile museum, and why not, have a museum where people could go in and walk in, and why take it to them?
Yeah. So the main thing is about accessibility and to be able to take this experience to places that wouldn't necessarily ever come to a Black History Museum, who don't have access to a Black History Museum anywhere near them. You know what I'm saying? You would have to go, states away to get to a Black History Museum. So, really it was about accessibility, but also realizing down the road too that this, this idea is nothing new. This is something that Black educators, collectors, museum folks have been doing prior to them having brick and mortar museums. So if you go back to the early 1900s and all the way up into the 1960s, you have people who are taking artifacts because they understand the value of memory, history, and they're taking artifacts to schools, they're taking them to churches and other places around the country to make sure that people are learning about our history. So I've come to realize I'm a part of that legacy as well. You start doing certain work and you think that you're the only one, and then you realize that it's nothing new under the sun, right? And then you realize the importance of this larger work and where you stand in this history and this legacy. So not only are you teaching this history, but you're also making history as well.
Yes, sir. Yeah, man. That's like I said, man, I think it's amazing work that you're doing. And it's going to just get bigger and bigger, man. I want to take some time to go over just a few of your items. I know you got tens of thousands of items. We can't go over everything, but just a few things I think that are important. So you have actual like slavery chains. Can you talk about like where you got those from and what people have like the response have been to that?
The first set of chains I got came from a Civil War trade show. So all around the country, you have different types of trade shows, and in this particular trade show, were dealers in Civil War memorabilia. So there were probably 100 or so vendors. People were selling Civil War uniforms and weapons and newspapers, photographs, and all types of stuff related to the Civil War. But of course, you can't talk about the Civil War without talking about slavery. And so a few of these vendors had slave related material. And this one particular vendor had these chains. And I had a conversation with him about them. And he said that these particular chains were found in an archaeological dig on a plantation in North Carolina. So when he gave me the history of those, I felt the need to, to pick them up and purchase them. So those were my very first set. Those chains, now that I've had them on the road for about 20 plus years, man, they've taken on a history of themselves in terms of the context of the Mobile Museum. And that's one thing that I don't let people touch a whole lot, but I let them touch those chains in particular. I mean, to pick them up, and for folks who, and people, they just have a need to want to touch them and pick them up. And when you pick them up and you hear the sound of them and you feel the weight of them, man, it's nothing like having the idea of someone who had to wear those day in and day out in 100-degree heat in the South, right? And work, from sun up to sundown with those on. But it brings tears to people's eyes, man. It's a very powerful teaching tool. And so, for example, I remember one class. You'll hear people say, "Oh, our students don't like to write; they don't like to express themselves." And so, one of the writing activities I used to do with my students would be to bring these chains in the class, shake them a little bit so you can hear the sound of them, and ask the students, if these chains could talk, what would they say? Once they had were tasked with writing that, man, you couldn't get them to stop, man. They got so creative and so into it that they were writing some powerful stories, man, and just going, giving them that creative license to express themselves like that. It's powerful. So yeah, the chains are a very important part of the collection, man. But yeah.
Yes, indeed. And I feel bad kind of like starting with slavery.
No.
So do you have anything before slavery? Do you have anything that you've collected that predates slavery?
Recently, I've started adding things that were prior to slavery, simply because to find the material that goes back to the motherland that predates slavery, it's very rare and very expensive. So what people need to understand, your listeners need to understand as well, is what people see of the Black History 101 Mobile Museum, especially back then. This all came from a social studies teacher's resources, financial resources, and as you know, they don't pay us enough, bro.
Man, don't get me started, man. Don't get me started.
I mean, so that's the challenge, right? So there was no way that I could get things that went pre-slavery. So and so there's been many times going into the circles I go into where people go, you start with slavery because our history doesn't start in slavery. It's like, I get that, but you also are not going to find another collection like this where you're going to see 150 to 200 rare artifacts, all original artifacts on display. So yeah, but last year I went to Egypt, went to Cairo with Dr. Ashwa Kwesi and his wife, and about 100 of us went under his Kemet New company, his tour company, man, and we went shopping, and I found some things, brother, that will blow your mind. And these things date back 1,000, 2,000 years, figurines. So I've been able to incorporate some of that material into the museum now. And I also have a lithograph from the 1800s from Timbuktu.
Wow,
yeah, which
that's amazing.
Like who's ever seen like original hand drawing of Timbuktu? Like maybe nobody, right? But this was a European's viewing interpretation of what they were seeing, and it's phenomenal, man. It's a small photo or drawing, but it's powerful, man. Like, we had libraries and cities and kingdoms that we're never taught about. And it's not until you go to the continent or go to some museums and take time and look, that you find that, man, our history is something that has been denied to us for many years now. And once we learn our history, bruh, it opens up a whole new world for us. And
Yes,
so
sir. Yes, sir.
yeah, man. So and it's funny. I'm still, as I'm doing this work, I'm still learning every day something new. Every
Yes,
day
sir.
learning something
Yeah,
new, man.
man.
So it's been a blessing.
That's amazing, man. All right. What about a Jim Crow era item that people are taking back on? I know you have a lot of
Yeah.
those.
So Jim Crow era material, segregation signs. People are taken aback by those things. Some of the advertisements, the sheet music. So I got this one sheet music that the song is called "Down Here Everybody's Happy." And so you get a sense of this campaign after the Civil War, because this sheet music is from the late 1800s, early 1900s. You get a sense that there's a campaign to rewrite the narrative of the reality of the brutality of slavery, of that experience for Black people, and to get white people to think that it wasn't as bad as y'all say it is, because everybody down here was happy, and and the image on the cover of it are Black people just dancing away, and we know
Mm.
that that's a lie,
Yes, sir.
because our families have the history, as well as what do these artifacts tell you? What does a whip and a set of chains tell you about slavery? It tells you that if it was all good, then
It wouldn't be me.
you would
Yep.
need a whip and a chain. You would need
Yep.
them. You know what I'm saying? So whips and chains tell you that there was some type of resistance going on, and people
Yes,
trying to
sir.
run away.
Yes, sir.
So when I
Yeah,
look
man.
back at my family's history and how I ended up in Detroit, Michigan, is because my grandparents on my mother's side, they immigrated to America right across the Detroit River in Canada into America. And how did that happen? Well, my great 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 grandparents left plantations in Virginia, came up via the Underground Railroad through Ohio, through Michigan, and crossed the river and settled in a place called Dresden, Ontario. And Dresden, Ontario was settled by this man by the name of Josiah Henson, who people know as Uncle Tom from Uncle Tom's Cabin.
Wow, man. That is a fascinating piece of
Yeah,
history,
so
man.
so
Thank
I
you for
mean,
that.
so not only do I live this history in terms of teaching, these artifacts, but this stuff runs in my blood as well.
Man, that's fascinating, man. Another fascinating piece you have is a civil rights era piece you have. It's a letter signed by Harry Belafonte,
Yes, sir.
Jackie Robinson, and Sidney Poitier. Can you walk us through that one?
Yes. And so the first thing I'm going to say is that if you ask me today where I got that letter from, I still could not tell you. I got at a point where at one point I'm just collecting. I'm going into places and just picking things up, collecting them, and just gathering things, and not thinking about, because at one point it's just me collecting. I'm not thinking
Right.
about preservation. I'm not thinking about cataloging. Preservation and cataloging is still my biggest challenges right now, and probably more expensive than I can't even imagine what that looks like. But I know when I got it because of those signatures first and foremost. And I got the letter. It had to be over 20 years ago. The letter did not reveal itself until I started my graduate work at the University of Illinois, working on my PhD. And it was
Hmm.
at that time that I switched gears in terms of looking at my collection as an educator and as a mobile museum curator, to looking at my museum as through the lens of a scholar and researcher.
Right.
Although I did research a lot of the material and presented material, but there was things that I've never really did deep dives into. One of the places I started was with letters. And so one day
Mm-hmm.
I looked at that letter, and again, put on the researcher lens and hat, and start reading deeply this material and trying to figure out who this letter was written for, and what was going on at this time. So this letter is written again by these three individuals. They're part of an organization called the African American Student Foundation. This letter is written in 1959, And so this letter is a fundraising letter that is asking for funds to bring African students from Kenya to America for a college education. So in
Mm-hmm.
1959, I think they brought initially 87 students over. And then from 59 to 62, they bring over a couple hundred students. And these students go to colleges all across the United States. And ideally, what they're doing is getting an American education and then going back to Kenya, this newly independent African state, and making a contribution to their country. So this one particular student comes over in 1960, I believe, and he goes to the University of Hawaii and he studies economics. And while he's on campus, he falls in love with this young lady and they get married. And I think a year later or 2 years later, they have a child, and that child's name is Barack Obama. So this,
That is
yeah, so
amazing.
this, so his father, was a phenomenal scholar, and ended up going to Harvard and doing well for himself, and then ends up going back to Kenya. But the rest is history.
Yeah, man.
Yeah,
That's fascinating,
and
man.
and so that letter ends up almost becoming viral online because last year when Sidney Poitier passed away, I posted the letter online in celebration of his life and just giving people
Mm-hmm.
a sense of his contribution beyond the screen. And so,
Right.
man, people took that letter and it just kind of spread like wildfire, man. And the next thing I know, that it got shared 5,000 times. So from my page. So if it gets shared five
Right.
thousand times, once it gets shared 5,000 times, it goes really, really wide, right? And so I started getting
Mm-hmm.
phone calls from people all over the world, man, with interesting stories. This one woman reached out to me and said that she went to school with Barack Obama's father, and that she remembered
Wow.
his father saying that he had a son named Barack. So,
Man.
I mean, I got stories like that. But eventually, ESPN reached out to me. And just so happened that last year was the 75th anniversary of Jackie Robinson breaking the color barrier. So all these things are lined up perfect.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so they asked me to include that in this documentary. I said, of course, I definitely could do that. And so they came out to the to Santa Clara University last year, about this time last year. And they filmed this interview, and this interview ended up becoming a part of this larger documentary with just some incredible people, everybody from Ruby Bridges to Chuck D to Jesse Jackson and other folk. And so it just created a lane in visibility for the museum that I was not expecting whatsoever. And so, and I always thought that, if somebody was going to be impressed with something from the collection, it would not have been that letter, you know. And so it really took on a life of its own. But I'm honored to be able to share that letter, and really just to be entrusted with all this material to share with the community.
Yeah, man. That is amazing, man. That's an amazing piece of history right there. Do you have anything interesting, 80s, 90s, or current day?
So I'm collecting. I'm doing hip hop material right now. So I'm collecting a lot of hip hop material. I think I told you that was Proof from D12's manager. And
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
so in the I met him in the early '90s or the mid '90s, and he asked me to manage his group called Five Elements. This is prior to Eminem signing to Aftermath, and so
Right.
I happened to be in the right place at the right time in terms of Detroit hip hop history, and connecting with somebody who was a phenomenal individual, and someone who was really a catalyst for many people's careers, including M's. But worked
Mm-hmm.
very closely with him. I mean, he was the type of guy who used to come to my classroom and speak to my students, and so I was because of my proximity to him, I was always collecting just things, even before I knew he was going to be who he was, collecting that type of material. And I always wish I was collecting a lot more. But, I've collected flyers and had photographs and autographs and magazines and those types of things. So, but yeah, I'm collecting everything that has to do with our experience, man. But
Yes,
because
sir.
it's the 50th anniversary of hip hop, I just wanted to give my brother a shout out.
Yeah, man. And I know current day right now, you say one of the top things that people get emotional about is the MAGA hat, right?
Yeah, yeah, man. So the MAGA hat is still there, very much present, and in the 50th anniversary of hip hop. Unfortunately, I have his hat juxtaposed to a photograph of Kanye West. Yay. And which is it is what it is. But the reality too is, although I have this museum, I also have to be forward thinking too as well, right? So if we fast forward 50 years down the line and think about what are those objects that will be in a museum that represent present day, right? And so I'm just collecting that stuff right now. So a MAGA hat is going to be in somebody's museum, right? We also have the power right now to determine what that MAGA hat means 50 years from now. You know what I'm saying? So is it going to be a symbol of freedom, patriotism, and positive attributes? And we talk about how is it going to be interpreted 50 years from now? Or is it going to be seen as a symbol of hatred, racism, misogyny, fear, and these other, negative attributes? And we have the power to determine what that means, right? So I have it. As a matter of fact, that's the very last artifact on display in the museum. And it shocks people. It shocks people even more than seeing the Ku Klux Klan hat at the very beginning. People are disturbed because, people are disturbed by the Ku Klux Klan material, but you almost can separate yourself from that, right?
Right.
But you put that MAGA hat in front of people, it messes them up because you can't separate yourself from that, because you got some people who walk through the museum and they're Trumpers and they're trying to figure out, why is this here? And you got some people who are disgusted by it, but it's very real and present. So they're not just kind of disgusted by it. They're really, really disgusted by it because of what it means to some people. So, but it's just one of the powerful pieces in the exhibit.
Fascinating, man. All right, I know we got to wrap up. You got to get going, man. So before we wrap up, just a quick activity. What's your favorite? Identifying a couple of your favorite things. So I'll ask you just a couple quick things. Favorite lesson that you learned from Dr. Pilgrim?
Man, I think the number one lesson I learned from him is the power of an artifact to tell a story.
Got it. Favorite workshop series that you've done with the museum?
Probably inquiry-based learning practices for teachers.
Okay. Favorite life gem that anybody has given you?
My favorite life gem, right now, we're in the middle of Ramadan. So there's only one God, but Allah. There's only one God. So that's my life gem. I mean, so that's how I live my life. And because of that life gem, it's about giving back. It's about being just to people. It's about reminding people that there's something higher than all of us, and that that we should consider that we're a part of a greater creation that ties us into not only other human beings but other species, other worlds. Like everything that we do as human beings is connected and has an impact on something else. So yeah. So in terms of life gem, as I'm fasting right now, about to break my fast, I'm thinking about just humanity and what we have to commit ourselves to make this world a better place for other people.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Favorite person you would like to sit down and have a conversation with, dead or alive?
That probably would be Malcolm X.
Had a feeling.
Yeah, probably be Malcolm X. Yes, sir.
All right. So Man, you're doing just amazing work, man. I think that's going to leave its own legacy and history behind, just all the work that you're doing, everything you've collected, all the experiences that you've had of people being in contact with some of the things that we talked about today, some of the things that, you know, we haven't talked about that you have a lot of. So you're leaving just a huge legacy, man, just on your own, just ideology. What is that legacy that you want to be remembered about, just the work that you're doing and what you represent for the culture, man?
You know, I don't see myself doing anything extraordinary. I just see myself, you know, somebody asked, well, actually, my wife asked me the other day about how I feel and how I do certain things in terms of education. And I told her, I'm simply a middle school social studies teacher. That's all I am. I mean, what you see is me doing work from the lens point of view as a middle school social studies teacher. So as I curate, as I do workshops, I'm doing it like I'm teaching sixth, seventh, and eighth graders. And I think that's one of the reasons, you know, one of the secrets of how it's been so successful and so accommodating to people. I mean, because and when you look at the diverse groups of people that I'm able to touch in these different audiences I'm in front of, you can't, you know, as a teacher, as you know, you can't decide on who comes in front of you, you know, and the baggage that they bring.
Mm-hmm.
You know, at some
Mm-hmm.
point, you know, there's a little Donald Trump in somebody's class. At some point, there was some little revolutionary Huey P. Newton in somebody's class. You know what I'm saying? At some point, there's a little Tupac in somebody's class. So if you have all these different types of personalities coming to you, how do you teach them to think critically, to be better human beings? You know, these are the things that educators are tasked with. So that's how I try to teach and try to think in a way that's affirming, that is not comfortable, that's challenging to students, that make themselves see the value in contributing to their communities and to the society as a whole.
Man, and you're doing amazing work. Like I said, man, thank you so much for this conversation. I could feel like I could talk to you forever, man. So we definitely got to do
We'll do a part
another.
two, bro. We'll do
Yes,
we'll do
sir.
a
Yes,
part two,
sir.
man.
Um, Before we leave off, Dr. El-Hakim, can you leave us with your favorite quote and what it means to you?
Favorite quote. Yes. The great Kwame Ture said, "The struggle is eternal." And I think about that often because sometimes people believe that, you know, you go through a process, and I hear quite a bit from some folks, you know, aren't we beyond certain things? You know, or I thought that because of Barack Obama or because of Dr. King that we you know made it. Aren't we progressing? You know, we might be progressing in some areas, but there's many more areas where we have to do a lot more progressing in, right? And there's never a point where it's done. You know, struggle is ordained by life itself. You know what I'm saying? Everybody's going to struggle, right? And I heard Kwame Ture say that one point that, you know, this struggle is eternal. Yeah, it doesn't stop. So we always have to be in a process of self-reflection, recommitting ourselves to the struggle, teaching ourselves the value of struggle and the benefit and reward of struggle, right? So yeah, when I think about that quote, those are some of the things I think of.
Man, thank you for that, man. Again, thank you for an amazing interview and all the information, man. I feel like I learned so much having this conversation with you, man. For those of us that want to learn some more and find out where you're going to be heading, or if you'll be coming to a town near them, where can they find the Black History Mobile Museum?
Yeah, so the Black History Mobile Museum, if you're interested, please go to blackhistorymobilemuseum.com, blackhistorymobilemuseum.com. You'll see the tour dates on there. You also can reach out to me via Instagram, bhistory101, or you can call me direct, 313-645-4197, 313-645-4197.
And you answer. I gotta definitely say that because some people give out that number and you get the voicemail right away. But Dr. El-Hakim answers the phone, so definitely give him a ring. Listeners, thank you for listening. I hope you had a good time and learned something as much as I did. Definitely learned a lot, and definitely check out where Dr. El-Hakim will be and support his work. And I think it's amazing work that I'm trying to definitely find out where he's going to be and go in person myself to experience this. So you should as well. And of course, always remember, your mind is the most powerful tool in the universe. Therefore, if you can think it, you can do it. If you believe in it, you can be it. And if you fight for it, you can have it. The world is yours. This has been your host, Mr. G, and I will see you next time on MasterMine.
So every day I'm going hard. I'm talking business, bank accounts, and credit cards. And somehow we defeat the odds and making sure that no one starves illegal. All you had to